The wind that morning carried the smell of salt and smoke across the harbor, curling through broken buildings and abandoned streets as if the city itself were holding its breath. For 3 years, the war had carved its initials into every skyline, every shoreline, every family. Borders had shifted, governments had fractured, and entire generations had learned to measure time by air raid sirens instead of clocks. On the hill overlooking the capital stood an unfinished clock tower, its face frozen at 11:47, its shadow stretching across sandbags and shattered stone. That was where Corporal Adrian Vale lay prone, his rifle balanced carefully against the cracked concrete, waiting for a moment that history would later reduce to a single sentence. Adrian had never wanted to be a sniper. Before the war, he had been a watchmaker's apprentice, fascinated by delicate gears and patient precision. He liked fixing things that were broken. But when the invasion came, he discovered his steady hands could serve a different purpose. Training officers noticed the way he controlled his breathing, the way his pulse barely shifted under pressure. He learned distance like other people learned language, calculating wind drift, bullet drop, humidity, elevation. Each number mattered. Each fraction of a degree meant the difference between success and failure. Still, no training could prepare him for what command asked of him that morning. Across the harbor, inside the fortified presidential palace, General Victor Sorin was preparing to address the world. He was the architect of the war, the man who had ordered missile strikes on neighboring nations and mobilized divisions without hesitation. Under his command, cities had fallen in weeks. Intelligence reports now confirmed what diplomats feared. Sorin was hours away from authorizing a final escalation, a launch that would pull multiple superpowers into open conflict. Once triggered, it would not stop at borders, it would not stop at oceans, it would change the map of the world in fire. Adrian's mission brief had been clear and brief. One shot, one opportunity. A narrow window during Sorin's live balcony speech when his armored shielding would be temporarily lowered for visibility. The distance, 1,340 meters across open water and crosswinds sweeping unpredictably between high-rises. Security teams had calculated a less than 30% probability of success. There would be no second attempt. Extraction would be uncertain at best. He adjusted his scope and watched through the glass as black uniformed guards took their positions. Below him, the city remained eerily still. People had been ordered indoors for the broadcast. Drones hovered like metal insects above the palace. Adrian slowed his breathing, counting silently. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. The rifle felt heavier than usual, not because of its weight, but because of its consequence. In his earpiece, the spotter's voice whispered wind readings from a nearby rooftop. Crosswind increasing, 2 clicks left, hold steady. Adrian made the adjustment. His finger rested lightly against the trigger, not pulling, just feeling the curve of metal. He thought about his old workshop, about tiny springs and ticking seconds. Time, he realized, was always fragile. Across the harbor, General Sorin stepped onto the balcony. Cameras flashed. His uniform shimmered with metals under the pale sun. He began to speak, his voice amplified through massive speakers, echoing over water and stone. Though Adrian could not hear every word from that distance, he recognized the cadence of authority, the rhythm of a man certain of his power. Behind Sorin, aides stood rigidly, one of them holding a secure launch case handcuffed to his wrist. "Wind shifting again," the spotter murmured. "Wait for it." Adrian steadied his aim at the center of Sorin's chest, then adjusted slightly upward for bullet drop. The harbor breeze gusted, tugging at his sleeve. A gull cut suddenly across his sightline, forcing him to pause. Sweat gathered beneath his collar despite the cool air. He had been in combat before. He had taken difficult shots before, but never one that carried this magnitude. This wasn't about a single battlefield or a single platoon. It was about whether millions would wake up tomorrow. The speech reached its crescendo. Sorin lifted one hand dramatically, gesturing toward the skyline as if he already owned it. The ballistic shield behind him shifted for camera clarity. The spotter's voice sharpened. "Window open. Wind steady. This is it." Adrian exhaled slowly and let the world narrow to a single crosshair. In that instant, the city disappeared. The harbor disappeared. The war disappeared. There was only geometry, distance, velocity, gravity. His heartbeat slowed until it felt separate from his body. He applied steady pressure to the trigger. The rifle cracked like thunder. Across 1,340 meters of air, the bullet cut a clean, invisible path. A fraction of a second stretched into eternity. Then, on the balcony, General Victor Sorin staggered mid-sentence. The microphones screeched. Cameras jerked violently. Guards lunged forward too late. The launch case dropped to marble tiles with a metallic clang that echoed even across the harbor. Panic erupted. Drones scrambled. Security teams flooded the balcony. Adrian did not wait to see more. Impact confirmed, the spotter whispered, disbelief mixed with relief. Target down. Within minutes, the palace sealed itself tight. Communications across the capital flickered. Conflicting reports flooded global news networks. Some claimed a coup, others suspected internal betrayal. But one thing was certain: the order Sorin had prepared to give was never spoken. Adrian and his spotter dismantled their position with mechanical efficiency. Shell casing pocketed, rifle disassembled. By the time helicopters began sweeping rooftops, they were already descending into the underground metro tunnels, blending into shadows like ghosts. The world held its breath for hours. Military analysts waited for retaliation that never came. Without Sorin's singular authority, his inner circle fractured. Generals argued, ministers hesitated, the launch codes remained unused. Allied diplomats seized the moment, pushing for emergency negotiations while rival factions within Sorin's regime struggled for control. What might have become a global inferno instead stalled in confusion. By nightfall, international broadcasts confirmed Sorin's death. Markets trembled, then stabilized. Troop movements along contested borders slowed. Within 48 hours, a temporary ceasefire was declared, not out of goodwill, but uncertainty. The war machine, once driven by one man's will, suddenly lacked direction. In a safe house miles away, Adrian sat alone on a narrow cot, watching the news on a flickering television. Commentators called it the turning point. Some labeled it assassination, others called it intervention. He felt none of their certainty. His hands, steady as ever, now rested uselessly in his lap. Had he changed the world, or had he simply removed one gear from a broken machine? Days turned into weeks. The ceasefire extended. International mediators brokered fragile talks that would have been impossible under Sorin's command. Prisoners were exchanged. Humanitarian corridors opened. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was a pause in the fire. Adrian eventually returned home quietly. No parade, no headline carried his name. Official records attributed Sorin's death to an internal security failure. That was how it had to be. Snipers, like watchmakers, worked best when invisible. Months later, Adrian stood again in his old workshop, the war officially concluded by treaty. He held a half-repaired pocket watch between his fingers, listening to its hesitant ticking. Outside, children played in streets that had once echoed with sirens. The skyline, though scarred, stood intact. He thought about that frozen clock tower overlooking the harbor, about the second his finger tightened and history pivoted. People would debate for decades whether the shot was justified, whether it prevented greater destruction or merely postponed it. Scholars would write books, politicians would claim credit, conspiracy theories would bloom like weeds. But Adrian remembered something simpler: the silence that followed the gunshot. Not the chaos on the balcony or the shouting of guards, but the sudden stillness in his own mind. In that stillness was the realization that sometimes the world does not change with speeches or treaties first. Sometimes it changes in a single breath between trigger pull and impact. He placed the repaired watch on the counter and wound it gently. The ticking grew steady, confident. Time, once again, was moving forward. The shot that changed the world had lasted less than a second. Its echo would last for generations.